You cannot do this!
She is mine. Touch her again and you die.
The chapel doors were already closing on her old life. Seraphina knelt at the altar with her wrists bound in ceremonial silk, forcing herself not to look at Lord Silas's hands, spotted, thick-veined, already possessive. The priest raised the blood chalice. Somewhere behind her, her own mother wouldn't meet her eyes. Then the stone doors exploded inward. Not opened. Exploded. Hinges tearing from centuries-old rock, dust and torchlight pouring through the breach like the hall itself had taken a breath. 100 nobles turned as one. And into the wreckage walked a man no one in that room had the authority to stop. "She is not yours to bind," he said, and the chalice shattered in the priest's hand before it ever touched her lips. Seraphina had spent 19 years being told exactly what she was worth: nothing, unless it could be spent. Her family's name still opened doors, but their coffers had been empty for a decade, and empty coffers make daughters into currency. She was the girl who never shifted, no wolf, no claim to the bloodline pride her family clung to in public and cursed in private. They called it a defect. They called her a liability dressed in silk. So when Lord Silas offered to erase her family's debts in exchange for a wife, no one asked what she wanted. They dressed her, they walked her down the aisle, they told her to be grateful. She had one flaw, they always said. One weakness that made her worthless. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Comment your country flag emoji, genuinely curious how many countries are watching this unfold with me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary morning that gives no warning for the ground shifting beneath it. Seraphina found it on her father's desk, the wax seal already broken, Lord Silas's crest pressed into red like a bruise. She wasn't meant to read it. She read it anyway, and by the third line she understood that her life had already been decided without her in the room. In exchange for the settlement of all outstanding debts, the hand of your daughter Seraphina in marriage to Lord Silas of the Western Hold, to be sealed before the new moon. She sat very still for a long time after that, listening to the house around her, her mother humming somewhere down the hall, oblivious or pretending to be, her younger brother's laughter drifting up from the courtyard, bright and untouched by any of this. She thought about walking downstairs and demanding an explanation. She thought about screaming. Instead she folded the letter back along its creases, set it exactly where she'd found it, and went to stand at her window, watching the orchard sway like nothing in the world had changed, when everything had. Her father found her there an hour later. He didn't apologize. He explained, in the calm, reasonable voice men use when they've already made peace with something ugly, that the family's debts had grown beyond salvaging, that Silas's offer was generous, that she should be grateful someone of his standing would still take a girl with no wolf to her name. "You were always going to be a difficult match," he said, as though her worth had been a puzzle he'd finally, mercifully solved. "This is the best outcome available to you." She wanted to ask what outcome he imagined for himself, watching his daughter handed over like a debt instrument. She didn't ask. There was no version of the conversation that ended with her father seeing her as anything other than a line item finally balanced. The days that followed moved with a strange, syrupy slowness, each one bringing her closer to the altar and further from any version of herself she recognized. Servants measured her for a gown she hadn't chosen. Her mother oversaw the fittings with a brittle cheerfulness that cracked at the edges whenever Seraphina caught her eye. No one asked how she felt. She had learned, over 19 years of being the daughter who never shifted, that her feelings were the least relevant currency in any room she occupied. The wedding was held in the old stone chapel at the heart of the Western Hold, a building so ancient the walls seemed to breathe cold even in summer. Candles lined the aisle, hundreds of them, their light doing nothing to soften the dread pooling in her chest. She walked toward the altar in silk the color of bone, her hands bound in ceremonial ribbon, and tried not to look at the man waiting for her. Lord Silas was not young. His hands were thick-veined, spotted with age, and when he took hers at the altar his grip was proprietary rather than gentle, the grip of a man closing a transaction. His eyes moved over her like an inventory. She kept her gaze fixed on the space just past his shoulder, on the flickering candle behind him, and told herself she could survive an hour. She could survive a lifetime of hours, if it came to that. She had survived worse. The priest lifted the blood chalice, murmuring the old words that would bind them, and Seraphina felt the last thread of her old life pulling taut, ready to snap. That was when the doors gave way. Not opened, destroyed, the ancient hinges tearing free of stone that had held for centuries, the sound like the hall itself crying out. Dust and torchlight poured through the breach. Every guest turned as one, gasping, and into the wreckage of the doorway stepped a man whose presence alone seemed to press the air flat. He was tall in a way that made the chapel's high arches feel suddenly small, dark-haired, dressed in black that carried no ornament because he needed none. Power like that didn't require decoration. His jaw was set, his eyes carried the low, banked heat of something that had been waiting a long time to stop waiting. Seraphina didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. Every instinct in her body recognized him before her mind caught up. Alpha King Eric, ruler of the Northern Pax, a man who did not attend weddings he hadn't been invited to unless he intended to end them. "She is not yours to bind," he said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It filled the hall the way flood water fills a valley, total, inevitable. The priest's hand shook so violently the chalice slipped and shattered against the stone floor, blood-dark wine spreading like a warning across the tiles. Lord Silas's grip on her wrist tightened, more reflex than resolve, and Seraphina felt something in her chest she hadn't allowed herself in years. Not hope, not yet, but the terrifying possibility of it. "This is a sanctioned union," Silas said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "You have no claim here, Your Majesty." Eric crossed the length of the aisle without hurry, guests parting around him like water around a stone, and stopped close enough that Seraphina could feel the heat radiating off him, could see the muscle working in his jaw as he looked at Silas with something colder than contempt. "I have every claim," he said. "She belongs to the crown's protection, and has since before you thought to sell her." The words landed strangely. Protection, not possession, though the distinction wouldn't fully make sense to her until much later. In that moment all she understood was that Silas's hand had gone slack around her wrist, that the guards flanking the altar had gone still, uncertain whose orders to follow, and that for the first time in weeks she could breathe. Eric turned to her then, and whatever fury he'd carried into the room gentled, just slightly, when his eyes found hers. "You're safe," he said, quiet enough that it felt meant only for her, though the whole hall could hear it. "No one binds you against your will. Not today. Not ever again." She didn't have the strength to ask what he meant by that, not with 200 eyes on her and her whole life rearranging itself in real time. She let him take her hand. Not grip it, the way Silas had, but hold it, like something worth being careful with, and let him lead her out of the ruined chapel, past her father's stunned face, past her mother's hand pressed to her mouth, out into air that tasted, for the first time in weeks, like it might belong to her. The journey to the mountain stronghold took the better part of 2 days, the landscape climbing from soft farmland into granite and pine, the air thinning and sharpening with every mile. Eric said little, riding ahead of the small guard he'd brought with him, though every so often he glanced back to make sure she was still there, still steady in the saddle, as though some part of him didn't fully trust the world not to take her again the moment he looked away. The fortress itself rose out of the mountainside like it had grown there rather than been built, dark stone against darker rock, banners snapping in wind that never seemed to stop. Inside, it was warmer than she expected, firelight and old tapestries, the low murmur of a court that fell silent the instant she entered a room and resumed, quieter, the instant she left it. She was given chambers finer than anything she'd owned in years, a wardrobe, a maid, the trappings of comfort. But comfort and belonging were not the same thing, and she felt the difference in every glance the courtiers gave her. Polite on the surface, appraising underneath, the way people look at something they haven't decided is safe yet. Ward of the King, they called her, the title carrying just enough ambiguity to keep the whispers alive. Some believed she was his prisoner. Others believed something stranger, that she was the reason the king had ridden south with no warning and torn a wedding apart with his bare will. No one asked her directly. She was beginning to learn that in this fortress, questions traveled sideways, never straight. Eric kept his distance in a way that felt deliberate, formal audiences only, always a careful space between them, though she caught him watching her sometimes across the great hall with an intensity that didn't match the distance he maintained. She wanted to ask him why he'd come. Why her? What he'd meant by protection and since before you thought to sell her. But every time she gathered the courage, some new obligation pulled him away, and the questions piled up unanswered, heavier each day. It was in the fortress archives, 3 weeks into her strange new captivity of comfort, that she found the first thread of an answer, not from Eric, but from an old steward who let slip, in the careless way of a man who didn't know what he was revealing, that Lord Silas had sent 2 messengers to the fortress gates in the last week alone, both turned away, both refusing to say what business they carried. Seraphina sat with that information a long time, turning it over like a stone in her palm. Silas had lost her. He had not, it seemed, lost interest. She thought of the way his hand had gripped her wrist at the altar, less like a man losing a bride and more like a man losing an asset he intended to reclaim. She thought of the letter on her father's desk, the debts too convenient, the offer too generous for a girl everyone agreed was worthless. And she began to understand, with a cold clarity that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, that whatever Silas had wanted from her, it had never been a wife. It had been something else entirely. Something he was not finished pursuing. Comment the emoji that matches how you're feeling right now. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly who's with me as this story keeps unfolding. The training began at dawn, in a stone courtyard swept clean of frost, and it did not resemble anything Seraphina had expected. She'd imagined swords, perhaps, or the brutal drilling she'd seen inflicted on soldiers in her father's service. Instead, Eric had her sit, palms open on her knees, and simply breathe. Power like yours doesn't answer to force, he told her, crouched across from her in the pale light. It answers to recognition. You've spent your whole life being told the thing inside you doesn't exist. First we have to convince it otherwise. She was skeptical, and said so. He didn't argue, he only asked her to close her eyes and reach for the warmth she'd always assumed was just anger, just grief, just the ordinary ache of being unwanted. What she found instead, beneath weeks of patient instruction, was something vast and coiled and entirely her own, humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat that had been waiting her whole life to be heard. You were never without a wolf, Eric said, the first time a faint silver light traced itself along her hands and startled her into gasping. You were carrying something a wolf couldn't hold. She wanted to ask what that meant, but the answer, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction, not from Eric, but from a locked chest in the fortress archive that the old steward, out of some flicker of guilt or loyalty, finally let her open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a hand she didn't recognize but that made her chest ache on sight. They were addressed to a name she hadn't been called since infancy. To my daughter, wherever they've hidden you. The truth unspooled slowly, and it gutted her more thoroughly than the wedding ever had. The parents who raised her, who sold her, were not her blood. She had been placed with them as an infant, hidden after her true parents were murdered by a secret order Silas belonged to, a society of aging nobles who had spent decades hunting bloodlines like hers, bloodlines that carried power too vast for an ordinary shift, power they intended to drain and consume to lengthen their own borrowed lives. Her adoptive family had known, at least in part, what she was. The debts, she now suspected, had never been entirely real, or if they were, Silas had made certain they existed, engineering the very trap he then offered to solve, all to reclaim what his order had lost track of 18 years ago. She sat with the letters for a long time, grief and fury tangled too tightly to separate. Eric found her there near midnight, and didn't offer empty comfort. He simply sat beside her on the cold stone floor and let her talk until she had no more words left, and then simply stayed until she did. It was 3 days later that the betrayal came, and it came from a direction that made the fortress feel, for the first time, unsafe. Lady Ophelia, one of Eric's own inner circle, a woman who had smiled at Seraphina across 100 dinners, was discovered attempting to slip her out through the old servants' passage in the dead of night, a hooded escort waiting in the tree line beyond the walls, Silas's crest stitched into the lining of their cloaks. Seraphina woke to a gloved hand over her mouth and the cold press of a blade at her side, murmured instructions to stay quiet, to walk, to not make this harder than it needed to be. Weeks ago, she would have gone rigid with terror and done exactly as told. Instead, something in her, the thing Eric had spent weeks teaching her to recognize, rose up without her asking it to. The light came first, silver white and searing, pouring from her skin like something long damned finally breaking its banks. Ophelia stumbled back with a cry, the blade clattering from her hand, and the hooded men in the passage froze as the corridor around them buckled with a pressure that had no source but Seraphina herself. She didn't decide to push. She simply exhaled, and the force of what lived inside her answered, throwing every one of them backward into stone hard enough to leave them gasping on the floor. She stood in the wreckage of the passage, chest heaving, hands still lit faintly silver, and understood with total clarity that she had not been waiting for someone to save her. She had been waiting to discover she didn't need saving at all. Eric arrived moments later, drawn by the shockwave that had rattled the fortress to its foundations, and found her standing over her would-be captors, unharmed, unshaken, more herself than he had ever seen her. He didn't rush to her side the way she half expected. He simply looked at her, at the light still tracing her hands, at the steadiness in her spine, and something in his expression shifted from protective to something closer to reverence. "I told you," he said quietly, "that you were never without power. I don't think either of us understood how much." Ophelia confessed everything before dawn. The order, the plan to drain Seraphina at Silas's compound in the Western Hills, the network of allies still embedded in courts across the kingdom, all of it laid bare under Eric's cold, unrelenting questioning. What emerged was worse than either of them had feared. Silas didn't intend to simply reclaim Seraphina. He intended to finish what her parents' murder had started, using her not as a bride but as a vessel to be emptied, her power redistributed among his order like spoils. The confrontation, when it came, was not subtle. Eric marched on Silas's western hold with a force the old lord had no army to match, and Seraphina rode at his side, not hidden behind guards, not shielded from the danger, but present, visible, a queen in every way but title. Silas met them in his own great hall, flanked by the last of his allies, his composure cracking as he realized the girl he'd once bound at an altar now stood before him crackling with a power his entire order had spent decades trying to steal. "You were always meant to be small," Silas spat, though his voice shook with the first real fear she'd ever heard from him. "Delicate. Grateful. This," he gestured at the light still humming faintly beneath her skin. "This was never meant to be yours to control. It was never yours to take," Seraphina said, and her voice didn't shake at all. What happened next was less a battle than a reckoning. She didn't need Eric to fight for her, though he stood beside her the entire time, a wall of quiet, furious loyalty, cutting down every guard who came too close. The power she'd spent a lifetime being told didn't exist rose through her like a tide finally allowed to reach shore, and when it broke over Silas and the remnants of his order, it didn't destroy them so much as unmake the hold they'd had on her world for 18 years, the fear, the smallness, the lie that she had ever been anything less than exactly what she was. Silas did not survive the fall of his own hall. His order scattered in the weeks that followed, hunted by a crown now fully aware of what had been hiding in its own courts, and Seraphina stood at the center of it all, no longer a debt to be settled or a secret to be hidden, but a sovereign force in her own right. The court that had once whispered about a king's ward now watched, in hushed and altered reverence, as Eric knelt before her in the same stone courtyard where her training had begun, and asked not for her hand in the old, transactional way her family once offered it, but for her partnership, equal, chosen, freely given. She said yes not because she needed saving, and not because she needed a crown, but because for the first time in her life, someone was asking rather than deciding for her. They were bound not at an altar of borrowed silk and stolen consent, but beneath open sky, before a kingdom that finally understood the difference between a woman who had been taken and a woman who had chosen to stay. Comment, "I'm here," and drop the city or country you're reading from. I'm saving every single one, and I can't wait to see the whole map of you all by the end of this.